Good morning. There we go. It's good to see everyone here. I know it's only half the team up here teaching, but Adam is sick this morning. He did test negative for COVID, so it's not COVID. He doesn't have a rash, so it's not West Nile. So we've narrowed it down to we think it's just a summer cold. His RN mom told him so. That's where we're at on that, but he's going to stay home. And I am going to try and teach the class by myself. We're in lesson 6. We're still in Gideon, but we're in chapter 8 of Judges, so hopefully this will be our last lesson on Gideon. That's the end of the announcement. So let's begin class with the prayer. Our dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for your many blessings. We thank you, Father, for the clear skies. We thank you for the cooler weather. We thank you, Father, for all kinds of weather, because it makes us know that with the change of seasons that there's always something to look forward to, and that you are in control of our lives as the creator of this world. And we'd ask you, Father, to please be with those over in Afghanistan, those that are trying to leave. We'd ask you, Father, to please protect them. Please protect those that are protecting them. Keep them safe. We're ask you, Father, to please be with all of those that are serving our country, especially those in foreign countries. Please, if it is your will, bring them back safely to their families. We'd ask you, Father, to be with us this morning as we study from your word. We realize, Father, that this is a book from the Old Testament, but that we can learn so much about how we as Christians can respond to you and relate to you and use it as a guide in our lives along with the New Testament. We're thankful, Father, for your word and the fact that it has come down to us through the centuries. And we ask you, Father, to please be with us, that we would not read into it more than is there, but that we would also see the application and the lessons that you have placed there for us and for our lives. In your Son's name we pray. Amen. Okay. I'm going to try and start with telling a story. This probably isn't a true story, but it makes a moral or an application. This story takes place in the months following the end of World War II, and it's about a well-known general. I won't mention any names, but he has an assistant that's this lieutenant that schedules his time for him, and he's making this speaking tour around the Northeast. And part of this tour, they have to catch a train to the next location, and they get to the train station a little late, so they rush to get on the train, and they barely make it on the train, and there's just a couple of seats left. And so they sit down across from a pretty young lady and a grandmother. And so they sit down, and as the train's taking off, they make some conversation, some pleasantries, and then shortly after that, they kind of lapse into silence. Well, this particular train route has a tunnel that they go through, and so they come to this tunnel, and it gets dark, black, all of a sudden. And with the monotonous clickety-clack, clickety-clack, clickety-clack of the train tracks, all of a sudden that's interrupted with a kiss and a slap. And then they enter the daylight. You know, and as they enter the light, the general thought to himself, I'm mighty proud of that young man. Using the cover of darkness to steal a kiss from that pretty young lady. I just wish that young lady hadn't slapped me so hard. And the young lady was thinking to herself, that was really sweet of that young man to give me a kiss. I just wish my grandmother hadn't slapped him for it. And the grandmother was thinking, the audacity of that young man taking advantage of my granddaughter that way. Well, at least she had the sense to slap him for it. You see, in the moments following the darkness of the tunnel, there was only one of the four that was truly pleased with the trip. It was the young lieutenant assistant who realized two of his long-held goals. One was to steal a kiss from an attractive young lady, and the other was to slap his general. So, the moral of that story is it's important to take advantage of the opportunities that you are given in life. That's especially true when it comes to those who are Christians. You know, we have a Heavenly Father, and He works in our lives, and He is trying to accomplish His good will, but we need to take advantage of the opportunities He gives us. When I was about a 19-year-old, I was up in Alaska, and I was working for Columbia Christian College and was working with the church there in Anchorage, and didn't have a car at the time. I can't remember now, back that far. Why? But I was having to go either from somebody's home to the church or vice versa, but I was using public transportation and got on a bus and happened to sit down on this crowded bus next to this young lady. And this is a true story. This is not this is a real story. And I don't know, we were on this bus 15 or 20 minutes, but we struck up a conversation, and I asked her if she was a Christian, and she said no, but she, by the things she said, and I don't remember the exact conversation now, all these many years, but she led me to believe that she was interested. So we had a good conversation about what it meant to be a Christian and everything, and she acted like she was interested. And we got to her stop, and I was still on the bus, and she got off. And as she got off, I thought to myself, I didn't get her name. This is before cell phones. This is before email addresses. I didn't get her name. I didn't get her telephone number or anything. And I thought, if I had only done that, I might have been able to follow up with this young lady. Who knows? She might have, she acted like she was interested in a Bible study, but I didn't have a chance to offer her one. So that was, to me, a missed opportunity. And here, 45 years later, I still remember that opportunity as a missed opportunity. Okay? So we need to seize the opportunities that God gives us. Not necessarily to slap somebody in a dark tunnel, but we need to seize those opportunities because God does give them to us. And God works through Gideon in the same way. He gave Gideon opportunities, and Gideon took advantage of that. He ended the oppression of the Midianites and the Amalekites. And with just 300 men, he routed a well-trained, well-armed army of 135,000 men. So God won a very astounding victory because Gideon himself, trusted God's will. And he had an opportunity afterwards, and that's what we're going to look at this morning, after that victory that God gave, to lead a wayward people back to God. And I think he missed that opportunity. And consequently, 40 years later, the people went back into their unfaithfulness and their idolatry. So let us be as watchful after their victory as before the battle. That's a quote from Andrew Bonar, a minister, about Gideon. Because a lot of times we aren't. So I was afraid of this, but you can't really see that map, but maybe I can point some things out. Gideon calls, after the 300 men rout the army, he calls the men of Asher down and they meet, and the men of Naphtali to come down, and his tribe of Manasseh to come down, and they come here, and this is where Mount Tabor is, which is just north of where the battle had taken place, where that 120,000 were killed. Basically killed each other with Gideon's 300 men gathered around their camp. Mount Tabor will come into play later. It's going to be mentioned. But this is the route of retreat that the Midianites take. And they come down to here, and right here, they split up, evidently. We'll see that as the story unfolds. And the kings cross the river here, Jordan, and go towards Karkor. And they end up there with an army of about 15,000 men. And the rest of the other Midianites went this way and ran into the Ephraimites, who came out of Ephraim and came up here and cut off the fords, which were the shallow places to go across the Jordan River, and kept them from crossing there. And they also captured and killed the two Midianite princes. Now, it was the kings that went on, but the princes they captured and they beheaded them, and they presented Gideon with those heads. So that's going to bring us up to chapter 8 of Judges. So the battle has taken place. We're down from 135,000 men to 15,000 men for the Midianites now. And then he's already in chapter 7 asked the Ephraimites to help him. They've helped him. They've presented him with, we'll see that in the first 3 verses. Then the men of Ephraim said to Gideon, "What is this thing that you have done to us, not calling upon us when you went to fight against Midian?" And they quarreled with him vehemently. Now, take anger and multiply it by 10, and I think that's vehemently. So they were very angry at him. But he said to them, "What have I done now in comparison with you?" Now, Gideon is going to show a lot of wisdom here, I think. Is the gleaning of the grapes of Ephraim not better than the vintage of Abiezer? And Abiezer is where he was from, Manasseh. That was his local tribe that he was from within Manasseh. And he said, "God has handed over to you the leaders of Midian, Oreb and Zeb. And what was I able to do in comparison with you?" Then their anger toward him subsided when he said that. Now, as I was reading through that first, and he talked about their vineyards, I'm thinking, he's making fun of these guys. But then as it unfolds, you see, no, he's really not. He's praising them on what they're good at and telling them, I would rather you stay there and produce your crop of grapes and your wine rather than, interrupt that. And besides, look at this. You've handed me the leaders of the Midianites. Look at the great thing you did. Doesn't even mention the fact that his men have destroyed an army of 135,000 down to now 15,000. Doesn't mention any of that. And the reason he doesn't is, I think, because he's showing some wisdom here, some tact. There's some passages in, I think he's showing some godly leadership is what he's doing. Trying to find the passages. Normally I could be looking for these while Adam's talking. So in Proverbs 15:1, "A gentle answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger." I think this is a perfect example of that. They were very angry with him. He gives them a gentle answer, and it turns away their anger. So he's showing a good sign of leadership there, in this challenge. "Better a patient man than a warrior, a man who controls his temper than one who takes a city." That's Proverbs 16:32. So Gideon is, showing some signs of leadership here by answering the Ephraimites like this. Now, during the time of Joshua, the tribes of Judah had all united to go in and take the land. But each time we see one of these judges come in and liberate the people from, because of their idolatry, God puts them into oppression, and then they get liberated from the oppression. And each time there's less and less cooperation. And we're seeing the friction here between Gideon from Manasseh and the Ephraimites. And if there were any two tribes that should have been united as tribes, it should have been those two. Why is that? They were those tribes started off as the brothers of Joseph, the sons of Joseph, and as brothers. I'll say that right in a minute here. So, and yet they've got. So, who is Israel? Is a question I would ask. Because as we go through the book of Judges, we're going to see that Israel is no longer this cohesive group that acts together in common interests. They all start thinking about their own interests. I don't know why Ephraim would complain unless it had to do with the spoils of defeating an army of 135,000 men. And this army had just stripped the whole country of all of their produce. So this army had all kinds of wealth there with them, and Ephraim saying, "You didn't include us." Now, he was able to placate them, but still, so different judges work with different tribes or groups of tribes. Deborah worked with certain tribes. Ehud worked with different tribes, and now Gideon is working with different tribes too. And, I guess it's best illustrated if we went back to chapter 5, which is the Song of Deborah. Deborah, there's some tribes that she blessed. There's some tribes because they cooperated. There's some tribes she cursed because they didn't participate in driving out the enemy. And then there's some that aren't even mentioned. So, and you see that with all of the judges as we go through here. So, if the narrative ended right here at verse 3 of chapter 8, how would you judge Gideon? Is he a very successful judge or not? I think this kind of an answer showed that he had grown and learned something from God. I think that he would be considered, based upon this and what he's done up to here, a very heroic judge. And he still is, or he wouldn't have been included in Hebrews chapter 11. But we're going to see as we go on, his problems, it becomes a little bleaker and bleaker for Gideon. What God has started, man has a tendency to put asunder. God started this, this return to him with the throwing out of Midian, and yet we start seeing cracks in Midian's faith also. The first one, and any one of these by themselves, I don't think would amount to much, but when you see all of them, it kind of makes us wonder. In other words, a sword for the Lord and for Gideon. That was what Gideon told the men to say, the 300 men, as they approached the camp of the Midianites. Now contrast that with what, not Joshua. Contrast that with what Joshua told the Israelites before they took Jericho. Okay? And I've got that written down here someplace, but I didn't highlight it. Well, I'm going to quit looking for it because I'm not finding it right now. But basically, I wanted to quote it word for word, but basically what Joshua tells the people to say when they take Jericho is, for the Lord, and that's what they shout when they blow their trumpets and so forth, and the walls fall down. But he doesn't mention himself, so... So is that Gideon claiming a part of the spotlight? It's certainly, okay, Joshua 6:16. I only highlighted it in pink, and yet I still couldn't see it. Shout, for the Lord has given you the city, Joshua 6:16. So the encouragement God gave Gideon at the tent of the Midianite soldier seems to have changed Gideon's attitude. Gideon then, and it doesn't say that God told him to, but in chapter 7, verse 24, he sent messengers throughout the hill country of Ephraim. So there's kind of a notable change to the narrative. Prior to this, it's the Lord's work, and he's using Gideon. And then after this, it's like Gideon becomes the central part. So let's see what happens now. Gideon sent the messengers throughout to gather the Ephraimites and other ones. And then when I return, that's going to come up in this passage right here, verses 4 through 12. Then Gideon and the 300 men who were with him came to the Jordan and crossed over. So part of the army fled south, and the Ephraimites took care of them. The rest of them crossed over the Jordan, and that's the group that Gideon and his 300 men pursue. They were exhausted, yet still pursuing. And he said to the men of Succoth. Now, Succoth and Penuel, these two cities that we're going to be reading about here, are in the territory of Gad. Said, please give loaves of bread to the people who are following me, for they are exhausted, and I am pursuing Zebah and Zalmunna, the kings of Midian. Now the other ones were princes of Midian. These are the actual kings. But the leaders of Succoth said, are the hands of Zebah and Zalmunna already in your hand that we should give bread to your army? So Gideon said, for this answer, when the Lord has handed over to me Zebah and Zalmunna, I will thrash your bodies with the thorns of the wilderness and with briars. Okay, so these guys are, they've seen this huge army come into Israel. They've seen a much smaller army leave. Gideon is in pursuit of them, but it's 15,000 men that cross the river, and then they see 300 men following them. Plus, you got to remember that 7 years has gone by when all of their food has been taken by the Midianites. They may not have had a spare loaf give, but still, if they had been aware of Gideon and what Gideon was doing for the Lord, you would have think that they would have assisted. And they didn't. And Gideon now starts acting like not just this meek, mild man, but he's acting like a general and saying, you will pay for this. And then he goes on to the next city. And that's verse 5. And then he went up from there to Peniel, and spoke similarly to them. And the men of Peniel answered him just as the men of Succoth had answered. So he said also to the men of Peniel, when I return safely, I will tear down this tower. Now Zebah and Zalmunna were in Karkor. Oh, we don't have the map up anymore, but it's very east of the Jordan River. And their armies with them, about 15,000 men, all who were left of the entire army of the people of the east, for the fallen were 120,000. That's where we get the number of 135,000. I can add those two together and come up with 135,000 was their total army. Gideon went up by way of those who lived in tents to the east of Nobah and Jopath. Yeah, I'm not going to try and pronounce that. And he attacked the camp when the camp was unsuspecting. Now, you would think after that first encounter that they might have been suspecting something, but once again, he takes them unsuspecting. And when Zebah and Zalmunna fled, he pursued them and captured the two kings of Midian, Zebah and Zalmunna, and routed the entire army. If anybody ever has twin boys, that'd be a good name for a couple of twin boys, Zebah and Zalmunna, but that's Midianite names. So if you want good Israelite names, there's a couple of guys in the Old Testament called Uz and Buz. And I for some reason, I like those two names for a couple of brothers. I picture Uz and Buz as being linebackers for University of Oklahoma or something, So anyway, I diverge. So he captured them. Now, is the Lord still on his side? He crossed the river with 300 and he takes on 15,000 and he defeats them and captures these two kings. It doesn't tell us God's on their side, but we can see from the results that God has to be on their side, or they would not have been able to accomplish this. So this has been a long and arduous pursuit for Gideon. He's very single-minded. All he wants is just some provisions for his men, and these two cities wouldn't help them. So guess what his reaction is going to be when he goes back? And he's accomplished what he's trying to do. He's going to do what he said he was going to do to these Gadites, these men from the tribe of Gad. He captures a young man from Succoth and gets from him the names of the elders and the leaders of the city of Succoth. There's 77 of them. He doesn't punish the entire city. He just takes those 77 men and publicly flogs them with briars and thorn switches. Now, I don't know just how bad that was, but I kind of picture that as a pretty harsh punishment. I don't think it was something some grandmother did to her grandson. I'm hearkening back to the days when I was a young man and disobeyed my grandmother, and she made me go and cut my own willow switch, and she spanked me. I think this was a little more severe than that. And when you compare this to what happened to the men of Peniel, he broke down their tower. I don't know how big a city this was, and killed all of the men. He didn't just flog them, he killed them. So that was the punishment for for not, participating and helping them as they pursued the men of Zalmunna, and that's, or the Midianites. Then we come down to verse 18, and if you can't read this, I encourage you to follow along in your Bible. Then he said to Zebah and Zalmunna, "Where were the men whom you killed at Tabor?" Now, Tabor, remember I pointed out on the map, is a mountain. This is something that happened before the battle with the 300 against the 135,000. This is something that's happened maybe sometime during the 7 years previous. But he said, "Where were the men whom you killed at Tabor?" And they said, "You and they were alike, each one resembling the son of a king." Now, I don't know if they are just complimenting him, but my guess is he does have that stature and does look, like a man who could be a king. And they're saying, "These men resembled you." And he said, "They were my brothers." Now, that doesn't just mean they were fellow Israelites, because he continues and said, "The sons of my mother." So they truly were his family. So why did he pursue the Midianites across the Jordan, do you think? I think there's some vengeance going on here. He's going after these kings because they had killed his family. And maybe he's the last of his father's sons that was left. And he says, "As the Lord lives, if only you had let them live, I would not kill you." So he said to Jether, his firstborn, "Rise and kill them." But the youth did not draw his sword, for he was afraid, because he was still a youth. Then Zebah and Zalmunna said, "Rise up yourself and attack us, for as the man, so is his strength." So Gideon rose and killed Zebah and Zalmunna, and took the crescent amulets which were on their camels' necks. Kind of an interesting detail that they would add. But we're going to see later on there's a lot of gold that the Israelites collected from the Midianites, and evidently that was one of them. Now, a man's not going to be able to carry, 10 pounds of gold around his neck, or, I don't know how much gold you could have on your ear, but we'll see in a minute that most of these earrings probably averaged about, a half an ounce that they wore, and we'll see that in a minute. But these crescent amulets were probably made of gold, and I'm guessing they were, a crescent is like a moon shape, moon crescent, and there would be a gold chain that held that amulet around the neck of the camel. So there was a lot of value there, and he took that for himself. Then the men of Israel said to Gideon, "Rule over us, both you and your son's son as well, for you have saved us from the hand of Midian." Now I'm thinking by this time he has probably returned to Manasseh when verse 22 takes place. So he's returned to Manasseh, and Manasseh at least, and maybe the other tribes that had helped in this, Ephraim, and the Naphtali, Asher, maybe it was all of them were asking him to rule over us. In other words, they were willing to make him their king. And not just him, but they were asking for a dynasty. You can be our king, your son can be our king, your son's son can be our king. As long as you want to, you can be our king. And again, here's a good response by Gideon. But Gideon said to them, "I will not rule over you, nor shall my son rule over you. The Lord shall rule over you." So he's saying, God is still our king. Let God rule over us. Now, this would have been a great place for Gideon to say, let's return to God. Let's throw down our idols to Baal. Let's burn our Asherah poles. Let's go back to the temple and worship God. But we don't see any of that taking place beyond this verse when he said, "Let the Lord rule over you." So then Gideon said to them, "I would request of you that each of you give me an earring from his plunder." Now, I don't know, either he's talking to more than the 300 men, or the 300 men had more than one earring that they could contribute. or they had gold earrings because they were Ishmaelites. Now, not the 300 men, but the Midianites were Ishmaelites. Who was Ishmael? What can you tell me about Ishmael? And keep it short because I have to repeat it. Abraham's son by Hagar, the Egyptian handmaid. Yes. Abraham's first son. Abraham and Sarah, if I'll give you a little history lesson here, just a review, a refresher. Abraham and Sarah, God had told them that he would bless them and their seed would be greater than the stars of the heaven or the sands of the seashore. And it didn't happen. And Abraham is, 86. Sarah's 85. Finally, they get together and say, we need to help with this situation here. So she gives him her handmaiden Hagar, who was the Egyptian handmaiden. He goes into her, and they produce Ishmael. Now, we all know the rest of that story, I think, but, time goes by. Ishmael gets to the age of 13, and that's when God gives Abraham the covenant of circumcision, and Abraham and all his household is circumcised, including Ishmael at the age of 13. A year later, after they've instituted circumcision, at the age of 14 for Ishmael, Isaac is born, to Sarah, at the age of 99 or 100 for Abraham, 99 for Sarah, I believe. 1 year later, they throw a feast for Isaac at his weaning. When he's being weaned as an infant, as a year old, they throw a feast, and guess what happens? Ishmael makes fun of Isaac. And Sarah hears that. Sarah goes to Abraham and says, I don't want him in our camp any longer. So then Abraham goes to Hagar and Ishmael, when Ishmael now is about 15 years old, and sends them off into the wilderness. That's not the end of the story. They wander around the wilderness of Paran. They're in the wilderness. They're about to die from thirst, and an angel of God comes to Hagar and directs her to some water under some trees and some shrubs. They find water. It saves their life. And then God promises them that he will bless Ishmael and will make of Ishmael a great nation and will give him 12 sons who will be princes. And the Midianites are descendants of these 12 sons. These 12 sons still live in the wilderness. They're nomadic. They're tent-dwelling people. They have camels. They wander around from as far as the Euphrates River to Egypt and, up to the edges of Canaan. There's a huge area that they wander through, these 12 princes, and God blesses them with that. And so that fulfills the promise that God had made to them. And not only that, but Ishmael's daughter is a wife of Esau. Esau marries Ishmael's daughter. So she comes in again to Abraham's family again. And if you continue reading in that story in Genesis about Abraham, when Abraham dies, Ishmael returns and helps his brother Isaac bury his father Abraham. So he still has a fondness for his father and assists in that. And then he ends up dying at the age of 137. And if you go over there today, all of the Arab people, after the example of Muhammad, claim to be descendants of Ishmael, and in return, Abraham. So you've got the Israelites, who are descendants of Abraham and Isaac, and you've got the rest of the Arabs, who are descendants of Abraham and his son Ishmael. And hence the conflict over there that diplomats find impossible to solve, because it goes back for thousands of years. and it's not something that a diplomat can necessarily solve. But anyway, enough history lesson. So they are Ishmaelites, and the Ishmaelites were known for wearing earrings. And the average earring, I think, would be about half an ounce. So if we keep going here, the weight of the gold earrings that he requested was 1,700 shekels of gold. Now, if a shekel was half an ounce, that's 850 ounces, which, by my calculation, is just over 53 pounds of gold that he requests. Now then, he tells him, don't make me a king, but you can give me this tribute, okay? Now then, who normally receives a tribute? Your king. So he's asking for something that a king would ask for, and yet he said, the Lord is our king. So he's kind of sending mixed messages to the people here. And in addition to the earrings, apart from that, the crescent amulets and the ear pendants, and I tried looking up an ear pendant, but a lot of your different versions will have something beside ear pendants there. Some of them will just have pendants. Some of them will have ornament. I don't, because I tried my best to find a distinction between an earring and an ear pendant. I didn't know what that was, but I think maybe it's just a difference in translation there. But this is all of this gold that he got and the purple robes he got from the Midianites, and Gideon made it into an ephod, or an ephod. What is an ephod? Does anybody remember that from your Old Testament? Who wore an ephod? A priest. All the priests wore ephods. The high priest wore a special ephod. The ephod had a front and a back to it. It had straps that held it on, over your shoulders and held the front and the back together. It had straps on the side that kind of kept it together. It had, the high priest had black onyx stones, and those stones were big enough that each stone could be carved in gold filigree with 6 different tribes of Israel on each one. And then the high priest also had a breastplate that went over the ephod, and that breastplate had 12 stones representing the 12 tribes and so forth. And so that was the high priest's ephod or ephod? Ephod. But the other priests wore those. Eli, when he was a youth under Samuel, had an ephod. David had took an ephod so that he could go into the temple. So he makes an ephod out of gold. So this is not something you could wear, because he made this thing out of about, over 50 pounds of gold. So this was not a garment that you would wear, but it was something that he took and placed in his hometown in Manasseh, in Ophrah. Okay? And what do you think the people did over time with that ephod? They started to worship it. It became a representation to them. First, it became a representation to them of God and what God had done, but then it just became something that they worshiped on its own. And what it became was a bridge for the people to go from God to the ephod back to their worship for Baal. And so at the end of the 40 years, it made it real easy for them just to return to worshiping the Canaanite gods again. So it says Midian was subdued before the sons of Israel, and they did not lift up their heads anymore, and the land was undisturbed for 40 years in the day of Gideon. Then Jerubbaal, the son of Joash, now Joash was his father, Jerubbaal, remember, was the name that he was given after he tore down the idols of his father. So that is Gideon. He lived in his own house. Now Gideon had 70 sons who were his direct descendants, for he had many wives. Who normally has many wives in the Old Testament? A king. So he said, I won't take the place, I won't be a king, but I'll let you give me tribute. I'll make this idol that I'll place in my city. I'll take a lot of wives. I will have 70 sons. We'll see later that God didn't bless him because of those 70 sons, because one of his sons is going to kill the other 69. But that's for next week. So Gideon, it said, Gideon, the son of Joash, died at a good old age and was buried in the tomb of their father Joash in Ophrah of the Abiezrites. Then it came about as soon as Gideon was dead that the sons of Israel again committed infidelity with the Baals and made Baal-beth their god. So the sons of Israel did not remember the Lord their God, who saved them from the hands of their enemies on every side, nor did they show kindness to the household of Jerubbaal, that is Gideon, in accordance with all the good that he had done for Israel. So they did give that gold, but then 40 years later, they had forgotten all that he had done for the people, and they left him. And the son, one of his sons, we'll see in chapter 9, is Abimelech. Abi, father, Melech is king. So Abimelech literally is translated, my father is king. So again, another sign that Gideon, although he didn't accept being king, he behaved like a king. He even named his son to show that he was a king. So what's the legacy of Gideon? We're about out of time. Oh, I knew I had a picture of that. There we go. That one to the left is a representation of what the high priest would have worn. On the bottom, those are like pomegranates. The one on the right is, again, a representation of all the garments. There were like 6 priestly garments that the high priest wore. I like that black and white because you can kind of picture that as being a metal thing if that were the ephod that Gideon made. That's not, I don't think, what that's meant to be. But so he lives like a king, even though he he refused the honor of being king. Gideon missed an opportunity, I think, here of turning the people back to God. He had a great victory from God. He could have called the nation back to the Lord, back to the obedience of God's law, but instead he used the occasion, instead of using the occasion for God's glory, he kind of took the glory upon himself here at the end and for his own profit. When he refused the kingship, it sounded pious, but you see all these other things he did, and it's like he accepted the honor of being the king. And it reminds me of what Paul says in Romans chapter 7, when he says, I find this law at work. When I want to do good, evil is right there with me. For in my inner being I delight in God's law, but I see another law at work in the members of my body. And that passage goes on elaborating that, but I think that explains kind of what's going on here with Gideon. He wanted to do right. In a lot of instances, he did right. He's accounted in Hebrews as being a man of faith, and yet he still, did some damage and didn't leave things as good as he could have. What's my legacy? Have I sometimes celebrated myself rather than celebrating the one who has worked in me? Have I sometimes enjoyed the blessings more than the blessing giver? These are questions we can ask ourselves from the story of Gideon. Have I sometimes used religious language for personal goals? What legacy of faith are you passing along? What do you want to pass along? And are there any changes you need to make to pass those things along? That's our lesson today, so thank you very much. And next week we should have Adam back, so there won't be the pauses that we have.